Minister Anand Sharma, Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this public lecture by Minister Anand Sharma. For those of you who've been here before, you know that when you come to the Kuan School of Public Policy, the Dean makes 3 points. So the first point I'm going to make is about, of course, India and Southeast Asia, or India and East Asia. And I can tell you that one of the big significant shifts that we are seeing happening in this part of the world is what I call the reconnection of India and East Asia. The reason why I call it the reconnection is because before the colonial era, if you look at the subculture of Southeast Asian society, 9 out of the 10 ASEAN countries have what you call an Indo-based culture. And this is why the Ramayana and Mahabharata are found in the traditional cultures of Southeast Asia. And the good news is that the traditional connections that were severed by the colonial era are being reconnected. And if you want statistically significant proof, I can tell you the statistically significant proof is that since the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy was established 6 years ago, we now have, thanks to Minister Anand Sharma, 4 senior Indian ministers who have come to speak in our school. And believe me, this is something we would not have dreamt of when we opened the school. We had Minister Kamal Nath, Minister Chidambaran, Minister Lalu Prasad, and now, of course, Minister Anand Sharma, and all of them very senior ministers. And the fact that we've had so many Indian ministers coming to our school is an indication of how things are changing in the world. The second point I was going to make is about the whole question of an Asian identity that is developing. And I think, as I was explaining to the minister as you're walking up here, clearly one of the missions of our school is to train the next generation of Asian policymakers, and that's why only 20% of our students come from Singapore, 80% come from the rest of the world, primarily from Asia. Of course, their primary reason why they're here is to learn public policy education, go back and become good public servants or NGO workers or serve society in other ways. But in many ways, by bringing together such a diverse group, we are actually helping to create and reforge an Asian identity also. And this is why I told the minister this may be the best location for him to address the subject of resurgence of Asia in the 21st century. This is the most congenial environment for the minister to do so. Now, my third and final point is, of course, to introduce our speaker. Now, I can take a very long time with your distinguished career, but let me just mention a few significant points. And the first significant point is that he was first elected to Parliament in 1984 at the age of 31. Many of our students here, by the way, are 31 years old. So in that sense, you are a perfect role model for students because you show what can be achieved at a very young age. And indeed, he also became president of the Indian Youth Congress 1 year later in 1985. And as president, he was instrumental in convening an international youth conference against apartheid in New Delhi to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the African National Congress in January 1987. And in recognition of that, he was, of course, chairman of the Indian anti-apartheid movement. He also chaired the World Youth Action Against Apartheid. And I want to mention this dimension, Minister, because we are also developing our connections with Africa. And our guest of honor for our 6th anniversary celebrations next week is a very leading African personality, Mr. Mo Ibrahim, who's, as you know, created the Mo Ibrahim Prize for Good Governance in Africa. And that's a sign also of how things are changing. I also want to add here, of course, that Minister Anand Sharma joined the Union Council of Ministers with responsibility for foreign affairs in January 2006. He also assumed the additional charge of Union Minister of State for Information and Broadcasting in October 2008. And he became Minister of Commerce and Industry on 29 May 2009. I should add here that in addition to his considerable ministerial experience, He's also had a vast reservoir of knowledge in international affairs. I can say this with first-hand experience because I've actually heard Minister Anand Sharma speak before on many of these subjects. And of course, he has received many awards, including the Order of the Companion of Volta and the Commander of the National Order of Merit, for the first from Ghana and the second from Ivory Coast. So, Minister, you're obviously the right person to come and address our school. And once again, thank you very much for doing so. Please join me in welcoming the Minister. Thank you. And I'm going to hand over this to you. Then we can sit down after that.
Not too many things in my pocket. I should just, don't worry, you can put it there. Let's take my phones away from me. Can I put it here? That's fine. It won't interfere. Good. Mr. Kishore Mehbubani, can you hear? Yes. The Ambassador, High Commissioner of India, Mr. Raghavan, members of the faculty, senior officials, students, friends. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to come and share my thoughts on a subject which is dear to your heart. I am also very passionate about it. I am sure many of the others who are witnessing the changing world and the changing Asia, its emergence or re-emergence on the global scene. And particularly delighted to be doing so at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, which over the years has emerged as a leading school on public policy, not only in Asia, but in the world. We know it's named after the mentor minister who brought about a remarkable transformation in this country and inspired, as an iconic figure, changes both in policy formulations, in governance, in administration, transparency and accountability in many other countries as well. The world as such has been ever-changing, and nations have remained engaged, so have societies been. Dr. Kishore Mehbubani very rightly referred to the past, that what cultural exchanges had taken place between the countries of Southeast Asia, India, which is very well documented, whether we call it mythology, whether we call the epics written thousands of years ago. But if we go to those places, the fact is that the names are the same. You will go to Bali, you'll find a Bali and Sugriv battle drama being enacted. The Java Straits are there. All those names are real. That only confirms that whether it was an epic written, whether it was a drama, people were connected with each other. They traveled, they met, they did trade. And it was their creativity which led to emergence of nations centuries ago, which have made their own contributions over a period of time. But as the world changes, there have been developments which did affect countries and continents. We have seen that happening in recent memory. Whether I talk about the last 2 years, they have been dramatic. Last 2 decades, a major shift, tectonic shift has taken place in the world. Not the first that has been there. But last 2 years, the world which is globalized, interconnected, interdependent, realized that the world in which we live in, if the opportunities are global, where information and knowledge money, technology transfer very fast. Exchange of ideas, collaborations, initiatives between nations, whether in regional context or in a multilateral context. But the world does not only bring rosy picture of prosperity, opportunities. If they are globalized, so are the challenges, so are the crises. And that was a very painful realization, not the first one, because there have been many other episodes with the global economic downturn, beginning first with the financial crisis, leading to the economic crisis, the worst recession the world has seen in 7 decades, sending tremors across nations, testing very severely not only the ability, the mettle of nations, their leadership, but overwhelming economies. The pace at which it spread, unlike the previous crises, which were also of immense proportions, whether it was the 70s, whether it was the 90s in this region, which was experienced. This one was different. Why? Because it did not come out of or explode from Southeast Asia or Mexico or Argentina. It exploded from the very heart of the capitalist world, affecting nations, economies big and small. But there was no uniformity. It was universal. It was uneven. Some countries were badly affected adversely. Some were less adversely. We in India, many other economies of Asia, including China, belong to the latter category, which were less adversely impacted. But nobody was insulated. We in India were dragged down. I was saying this morning, from where we were, consistently growing for 5 years at over 9% of the GDP, we pulled down to 6.7%. When I say 6.7% to my audience or interlocutors in the Western world, they say, wow, that was great. It was not, because we do need very high growth for reasons which are historical, the realities of the challenges confronting our society. And these challenges have been monumental, particularly after our emergence as independent nations. But at the same time, it remains a fact that when major economies went into contraction, it was the developing world, particularly the emerging economies, and Asia, which led the revival. Having said that, I am not here to suggest that the revival is complete. But we have been the engines of growth. 60% or more global economic growth is coming out of the emerging and developing economies. And that has helped even the industrialized countries, which went in to contraction, job losses, global trade contracted, industrial production, because the demand is not there. Over 40 million people lost jobs. The social dimension has not been adequately commented by many of the pundits and analysts who are now telling us what is going to happen in future. And I say, with due respect, not causing any offense, that we have to take it with a fistful of salt because they never saw it coming in the first place, majority of them. There was no alarm bells which ever rang before the roof came down. So we have to be careful. We have to be analytical. Can I have some warm water? Before we make the final conclusion about the recovery being soundly on course, but at the same time, the recovery that we see is uneven, is the same pattern that we saw at the height of the crisis. It's weak in many of the major economies. And even the weak recovery is a jobless recovery. Jobs have not come back in industrialized countries. That remains a matter of grave concern for those countries, but for the rest of the world. Because we wish recovery to be robust in industrialized countries, for the global economy to be strengthened, and global commerce to be enhanced. If that doesn't happen, there will always be a dip somewhere. There have been developments recently, again, which have been a matter of concern, particularly in Europe. But what is important to remember, that it was a world which, as I said, so much has changed in the last 2 decades. Ever since the Berlin Wall came down, and the big boundary more in mind than that geographical territory where the wall stood between the East and the West Germany. Many of the barriers came down, and there have been changes in the world. A new picture emerging. You would recall, in early 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and this wall, what became a fashionable statement was that it is a unipolar world, with one superpower which will determine the future course. I had always maintained that that was transient period of history. It could not have been frozen in that state. It would change. Because the world is too big. The problems that we face are huge. And no country or a group of countries have the capacity or the ability to address alone and resolve the challenge that the world faces. Therefore, it was a different world which addressed this global challenge, where new poles had emerged in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in South Americas. It was not the G7 or the G8 which could sit and address this. It had to be a representative and democratic grouping of G20 countries, which is reflective of the shift that is taking place in the world and truly representative of the contemporary realities. Countries which together have more than 2/3 of the population, 3/4 of the economic growth. These are the countries where leaders came together, sat together, governments intervened, timely in giving support, stimulus packages. The arrest was only of the fall. Therefore, now, recently the G20 summit has concluded, and my Prime Minister had spoken there, Dr. Manmohan Singh, given his sound understanding of global economics, international finance, that the recovery is weak. We believe, therefore, that the calls of withdrawal of government intervention or stimulus, to be precise, as the word is used, are premature. It has to be calibrated and measured. nation-wise and sectorally. It cannot be abrupt. It will hurt more than heal the nations and the economies, and be counterproductive also for the recovery. So it is in that backdrop that we are discussing this subject here about the resurgence of Asia. Now, it's not that the countries of Asia have not been there in the past. As we were referring to, rich in history, culture, civilization nations. But in the contemporary context, many can be described as young nation states. When we look at the period for which they have been independent as modern nations, or the demographic profiles of these countries, it was long ago, but how long or distant are the times in history, it's difficult to describe. People they have their own individual interpretation of how far is distant. But it was perhaps in the 16th century, 17th century, when Asia contributed more to the global GDP, much more than the present G7 industrialized countries. Trade in Asia has been there well before the industrialized world became powerful in trade. It's India itself, China. Silk route was the traditional route for trading. It was in the 3rd, 4th century when cotton came from India, traveling along the route, reaching Europe, Egypt, Cyprus, and onward through the Nile to Africa. And the two countries, China and India, were contributing more than 50% of the global GDP. It's a fact of history. And then the change came. The change is the only permanent factor. And that came with the Industrial Revolution, the technologies that came, riding the wave. It changed the destinies of nations, benefiting and rewarding those who had it, punishing those who didn't benefit from that change. So this was not one, but many developments of that period which changed the destinies of the countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America. And that brought with it another phase, which I can say that we have shared experiences. And countries were colonized, denied to make their own decisions, denied access to or exploitation of their own resources. Impoverishing hundreds of millions, not in one generation, but generations to follow. It happened in my country, it happened here, it happened in China. And that was one phase. And the last century saw these two world wars. And now in the 21st century, the second decade, as we have entered, we see a different global picture. There is definitely a shift that has taken place, a reality which is being grudgingly acknowledged and accepted. And it should not be resented when we see the economic growth that is happening in our countries, in our region, and in other continents. There are very many projections, very many studies. But the fact is that in less than 1.5 decades, 3 of the 5 major economies of the world will be Asian economies. 60% of the GDP growth will be coming from emerging BRIC countries. Now, this is very important. This is not a statement which I am making. And even in a decade from now, the size of the economies of Asia, EU, and America will be the same. So this is the direction that the world is taking. And that shift of economic power is real, therefore demanding a change in the global architecture, both political and economic, which I will refer to. It's not only that. Not that I'm painting a scenario which should alarm those who have done so well for centuries. But Asia's GDP will be bigger than the G7 industrialized countries. And why it should not be? We are talking of a region which is home to 45% of the world's population. Even today, the consumption in Asia is not huge. It's $7 trillion. In America, the consumption is 15 trillion, 7 trillion here and 15 trillion there. 45% of the population here, 5% of the world's population is there. So it's not a situation that has drastically altered, but it will change. Maybe the Asian consumption will go up to 20 trillion. And America's alone from 10, let me be correct, to 15 trillion. That is what the future scenario looks like. At the same time, vibrant economic growth, economic activity, which is taking place here, is bound to continue. Today, we see the countries of Asia realizing their potential and the fact that the future is in creating a cooperative mechanism, working together with each other. Though the world lives in a competitive environment, but to work together. As the famous Nobel laureate John Nash had said, that the real strength is in cooperation and not in competition. I've only met him once. I have followed some of his thoughts and works. Truly a remarkable mind. The most brilliant minds one can come across, Kishore. And that's what the countries of Asia believe in. The leadership, I can say. You see that happening in this region. It is happening between India and ASEAN, between India and China and ASEAN. And we are going beyond that. During my brief visit here, it's not even 24 hours. When I was last evening sitting with the senior minister here, discussing these subjects. Last year, India entered into a free trade agreement with ASEAN countries. We are following a policy which is called Look East. Though in the larger context, when you talk of planet Earth, then we are the countries of the East. But you're more East than what India is. And that's India, where India is seeking to connect, in its neighborhood, in its extended neighborhood. Many were wondering why we took that decision at a time when the global economy was in a recession. Thank God it remained only in a recession. But for what I was referring to earlier, it was not the coordinated response of the leadership of the countries, major emerging economies, it would have slipped easily into a Great Depression. But we did that, realizing this is the time to take decisions. We have entered into, signed, a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement with the Republic of Korea, exactly a week before we signed with ASEAN. We are currently negotiating the investment and services agreement with ASEAN. Once concluded, it will make it again a comprehensive economic partnership. We are doing the same with other major and emerging economies of the region, whether it's with Japan, bilaterally, with Singapore. We already have a SICA in place, and we are going to soon have a revised one. We have launched the second review in May when the minister from Singapore, Lim, came here to Delhi, and we hope to conclude that process soon. We are engaged in similar negotiations with Malaysia, with Thailand. So once all these are put in place, it will be clear that the countries of Asia believe in cooperation and also are looking at the real picture that this is where the future is. This is where the opportunities are. And if there was ever a time to take determined steps and decisions for a larger economic integration of Asia, this is the time. Many of you, because you are scholars, you would be better informed, also know that we are engaged in another negotiation, that is ASEAN plus 6. At all the ASEAN countries, plus the 6 other economies, that is China and India, 2 of the fastest growing economies, favored destinations for investments, but to also Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. That is the ASEAN plus 6. Now you can see the potential, you can imagine the picture. It's not only the numbers, but where the future is. And I did briefly refer to the demographics. Now it can be an advantage or a strength, and it can be a drag, how you look at it. I still recall, and when I was speaking to the leaders of the business this afternoon, I recalled how a few decades ago, when I was young, what was said about us. It was said about China also, it was said about India, that what is this country, look at the number of people, number of poor people. Now that poverty was an accident of history and colonization and exploitation, but it was referred to in a very derogatory context, without any respect to what these countries had in history over centuries contributed to human civilization. And the same big numbers show a different picture, a bigger picture, and they are referred to differently today. Because we were able to latch on to the new technologies, the wave which came, same time when the Berlin Wall had collapsed. Technologies of the late 80s, 90s, the first decade of this century. Leapfrogging to leadership position, straddling the divide which had come with the Industrial Revolution. Becoming leaders in information technology, space sciences, nuclear sciences. They're the same people. And when you see the economic growth going back to 9% as per the latest projections of the IMF 2 days before, there have been 2 upward revisions showing 7.5% economic growth projected for Asia, 4.5% for America, the industrialized world, and 9.4% for India, 10% for China. The same people, the same numbers become important, that these are rich human resources. They have access to institutions. More institutions of excellence are being created. They'll be trained in skills. They'll have opportunities. That is where you reap the benefit of the same demographic dividend which earlier was referred to as a curse. This is a major change or shift, along with the other tectonic shifts that have taken place, that acknowledgement that human resources, human minds are as important an asset as perhaps the wealth or the prosperity which was generated through economic activity over the last few centuries. So the countries of Asia will surely be beneficiaries of the demographic dividend. The world is going to face, it already is, a shortage of skilled manpower. Many of the countries which had become manufacturing powers have gone into decline. It's not that we are celebrating that. I'm the last one. We wish them well, more sincerely than what was wished upon us for a long time. But because of these changes, there will be the shortage of skilled manpower. From where will it come from? From where that will be filled up? That will be from countries like ours, stretching from India, China, across Asia, and also Africa, also South Americas. We ourselves in India are going to add 200 million to our workforce in a decade. Now, that's a big number. We'll be needing 500 million skilled workforce by 2020. That's the time by which India's own GDP is projected to quadruple. We are going to double our GDP in less than 5 years from today. We are the 4th largest economy in the PPP terms. We will be the 3rd largest economy in less than 2 decades in real terms. That is where we are poised. And that's where we are looking at the larger picture as to how Asian countries relate with each other. Yes, China is there, so is India. Normally referred to as adversaries or as competitors. Competition is healthy. That does take place. But we are not cast in an adversarial mode. We believe in working together, both India and China. China emerged, had overtaken America as India's largest trading partner. Then China was overtaken by none other than UAE. So these changes keep on taking place. But we believe in cooperation, we believe sincerely in the larger economic integration of Asia, which I referred to, because it has happened in North America's regional economic communities are becoming a reality. It has happened in Africa. It's not only Africa Union, but the other RECs, 7 regional economic communities. It has happened in South America. It has happened in Europe. Why not in Asia? And nothing can stop that process. And therefore, finally, what the world needs is not an acknowledgement, it's not a respect that Asia is seeking. It's both a resurgence and a re-emergence. We are referred to as emerging economies, but I said, and you know, that we were there. We are only re-emerging, and rightfully so, on the global stage, making our own creative contributions not only to our societies, but to the global community as such. And these must get reflected in the architecture, the social and political order. The shift cannot take place in real terms and not be reflected in the structures of the multilateral organizations, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank. You cannot call them representative and democratic if they are frozen in a world order that emerged after the Second World War. You cannot call. Kishore has been there as ambassador, as a senior diplomat at the United Nations. You cannot call the UN Security Council democratic and representative of 21st century world. How can you have a Security Council being called representative, which has no representative from the continent of Africa, 54 countries? Look at the population and where the world's population will be in 2 decades from now. 9 billion, 56% will be from Asia. No representative from South Americas, entire Latin America and Caribbean. And the largest democracy on the planet, India, a country of more than 1.1 billion people out of the decision making. This has to change. That would be necessary for the very respect and credibility of the multilateral system. And same must happen in the IMF and the World Bank. It is getting acknowledged. Slowly it's happening. And that's why I say it should be a respectful acceptance of realities and change, the shift that is taking place, not resented. That will take us together in building a new world architecture in which the world is at peace with itself and a better place for ourselves, our children, and future generations to live in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that very comprehensive overview. I'm going to take the privilege of being chairman to ask the first question, if you don't mind. You know, I wish
Can I make a request before that?
Which is?
Can somebody get me a cup of tea, black tea?
Yes.
Tea.
We'll get you some black tea.
Just for my throat.
Sure. I was going to say, I wish you were here 10 days ago in this room. We had a remarkable meeting in this room where we brought some of the leading Indian journalists and the leading Chinese journalists to talk about the role of the media in bringing India and China together. And I must say it was a very wonderful, frank exchange that we had in this room. But clearly, as you mentioned, the most important relationship in the world, not just in Asia, is the one between China and India. And one of the mysteries I've never quite solved is, you know, I remember somewhere in the year 2000, India set a target of achieving $10 billion trade by 2010, and it achieved it by 2004. Then it set a target of $20 billion in 2010, achieved it in 2006. Then it set a target of $30 billion in 2010, and now you already hit $60 billion, I'm told, last year.
More than 50.
More than $50 billion. So how did you set this very low bars for China-India trade, and how did you keep rising so fast? What was happening, in a sense, in real terms, in the real economy, behind the scenes, that's creating this explosion of trade within China and India? How do you explain this remarkable development?
You see, we have to view it in the backdrop of the developments in both the countries. China embarked on the path of economic liberalization, the opening up, at least a decade, 15 years before India. So we were late to take off, trying to catch up. And it's the economic activity in both the countries the industrial expansion, the strengths of the manufacturing industry, creation and building of infrastructure. It happened first in China. They're way ahead in creating truly world-class infrastructure. It has been happening now in a big way for close to a decade in India. And in the coming 10 years, India is going to spend $1.7 trillion. This figure may go beyond 2 in the next few years on its infrastructure expansion. And as two big economies of the region, neighbors, and two most populous countries, it's bound to happen. And it's also happening because we believe in working together, in cooperating. Sometimes we do have the issues of trade imbalances, trying to correct them. But the good part is we talk to each other very frankly, without any reservations on these matters. We have an ongoing dialogue at the highest level of the political leadership. We have an economic dialogue and a partnership which has truly grown. It's also because of supply and demand. China certainly has an advantage in trade. It is much bigger a trading country than what India is. Now, mind you, when I was referring to that period when the two countries contributed 54% of the global GDP, the largest trading country was India. Today our share is very small, not doing any justice to India's size, its population, its economy. Because China's economy is driven largely not by internal or domestic consumption, but by trade, and they have overtaken Germany as the largest trading country. But it also is a statement that there are no barriers in mind or in policy formulation between China and India as we seek to work together looking at the larger picture of what Asia has to do.
Thank you. Now, can I throw the floor? We have about 30 minutes for a question and answer session. Can I request that you identify yourself briefly and then pose a short and sharp question? And if you're a student of Lee Kuan Yew School, please say so.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Raska. I'm a PhD student here. Thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, I have a joint question for both Kishore and for Minister. You talk about broad resurgence of Asia. And I was wondering, whether you see a difference or similarities between Asian and Western approaches to global governance. In other words, is there a distinct Asian approach to global governance and the problems? And if so, what would that be? That is basically the core. Suppose that Asian countries do get a bigger share in global institutional order. How would they deal with the problems different way than current order?
Let me give you a very quick response. First thing to remember is that the structures that have been put in place for global governance, which I was referring to since the Second World War, have been unrepresentative and undemocratic. They've been exclusivist, not inclusive. What we will propose to do is to work as partners, not senior or junior, but as equals, with America, with the European Union, or with the industrialized countries, and to put in place global governance models and bring about changes in the multilateral institutions to restore the balance which is badly needed, making these institutions and governance inclusive. Was it clear?
Maybe Kishore can also chip in.
I think I agree with the minister. But actually, just to build on this question, I find, Minister, when I travel overseas, and I like you, I speak about the resurgence of Asia, the return of Asia, the re-emergence of Asia. The number one question they ask, which I think Michael is also asking, is okay, so Asia will be number one, China will be number one economy, India will be number two economy in the world. How will China and India run the world differently from Europe and America?
It's not a question of running the world differently. We are living in a different world. It has changed from what it was in 1945. We only say it is not China and India alone. That would be a mistake if we think, or Asia alone, that we will provide governance to the world and solution. As I said, if you heard me, that the problems are such, the challenges are immense, whether it is the challenge of energy security, the climate change, the pandemics, the conflicts and conflagrations in different regions of the world, that no single country and no group of countries, irrespective of their economic or military might, can address them. Global challenges require global response, a global partnership. That is what at least India believes in building, to work together, not talking of one pole or two poles, but ensuring that it is a multipolar world which responds to these challenges, which sustains the global architecture.
Thank you. I was going to mention, by the way, my next book is on global governance, so I'll answer the question. Use the microphone in front of you, if you don't mind.
Good afternoon, Minister. My name is Sam. I work for a local telecom company. My question is, there is a clear indication there is a shift of powers towards Asia. Are we ready and are we preparing towards the accepting the change, like building the infrastructure, or like you said, you're forming a cooperation between the other nations, and there'll be a lot of challenges before we accept a change. Are we ready?
I'm sure we are ready and we are capable of making our own contribution. It's not today. We should have been there long back, even before the economic resurgence. Because when we are talking of world as such, planet Earth is one and interconnected. Irrespective of the disparities of different regions. And therefore, global governance cannot be done by a truncated globe. It has to be done by the entire family together.
I see lots of hands up. I'll start with my good friend, then up there, then you, Chopra.
Narendra Agarwal from the Anand Business School.
Is the microphone on?
Narendra Agarwal from the Anand Business School at NTU. Minister, in your wide-ranging, excellent presentation, you observed that the global economic recovery is rather weak, and also that is a jobless recovery. So looking ahead, and from New Delhi, I want the view from New Delhi, how do you see, is really there a danger of a double-dip recession in the global economy? And God forbid, if that were to happen, what would it mean for the resurgence of Asia? Thank you.
You see, it's very difficult to become an astrologer.
Except in India.
But that would be a big change of profession. Okay. But just on the serious side, let me put it this way. First, what has happened to the world economy is not because of a single factor, but a combination of factors. Because they were votaries of the laissez-faire economy. The markets must rule, markets must determine, they must govern. The governments had no business to be engaged with the economy, they must withdraw. Then instrumentalities were created where there was no oversight, unregulated banking, crazy borrowing, mindless lending. People were made to spend the money which they never had. It's not a question of derivatives or the subprime crisis, mortgages. Well, people were lent more than the actual value of the house. And the bad mortgages were clubbed together and then made into parcels and sold to another one. Those who were doing it knew what it was happening. And that's what led to the crisis. Fortunately, those who did not walk down that path did weather the storm better. Take our case. Not that we are over-regulated, but we are regulated in a balanced manner. We never allowed our banks this kind of toxic exposure. Our saving rates are one of the highest in the world, so are our investment rates. Same is the case with China. So it was an oversight on the market, circuit breakers, regulatory mechanism which was in place. Now when it comes to forecasting a future scenario, first those who have been experts, I'm not an expert economist, it's just by chance that I was asked to take over the responsibility as Commerce and Industry Minister. But each one of us is, every day as a student, we all learn. But the recovery as such has been described in various alphabets of the English dictionary. It was said it will be L-shape. The L-shape is hardly a recovery, that you fall, then you just remain where you are, then you slowly go up. That also depending on how you write the letter L. Then it was the second alphabet of English language used is V. V-shaped recovery. This morning I was in the hotel gym and this is what they were talking about. I was listening on the television. That you fall, you quickly rise. Now that happened here in the late 90s. That has happened even during this crisis. That's why I use the word that it was universal but not uniform. Fall differed. But we bounced back very quickly. We never went into negative growth or contraction. The third alphabet, which brings me closer to what you are referring to, is the W-shaped recovery. That is the double dip. So whether you call it W, whether you call it double dip, because there are two dips. V as a single dip. Now, I do not want to paint a gloomy scenario. I can say that we are definitely not going for a double dip. We never went for the single dip also. China didn't go for the single dip. We remained in strong positive growth territory. We lost few percentage points. We regained, hopefully by now. Yes, the double dip, where the economies have gone into contraction, would be a serious challenge because you live in an interdependent world. The capital flows would get adversely affected. Capital flows had frozen after the crash of the Lehman Brothers. So global economy can be described as a single institution which collapsed. That's what happened to the world. Therefore, I did mention that even today, the tremors in Europe have been a matter of concern. Fortunately, EU and IMF have effectively intervened to stabilize the situation. And hopefully, I don't know the real picture, the exposure of the big economies and banks, that's of Germany and France and UK, is not big to what has happened in Greece, Spain, Ireland. Italy is not in that bracket, but yes, there have been matters of concern. So we should not, I don't think there is anybody who is in a position to give a definitive answer. You put four economists Together you will find 6 alphabets. Thank you.
Please.
Good evening, sir. My name is Raman from the School of Public Policy. This topic on resurgence of Asia is one of the school's favorite because we keep hearing about this every month or twice.
When your dean is leading the charge.
Yeah, but what we get caught up in is the tale of two Asias. I mean, there is one India, there is one China, there is Singapore, but there is also a Bangladesh, there is also a Sri Lanka or a Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Central Asian economies. Is there any chance of inclusive growth in all of Asia? Like there are no rich, poor divide, everybody grows. I mean, the PM Manmohan Singh also has an inclusive growth agenda. How does the Commerce Ministry contribute towards this agenda?
See, now when we say that all the countries must benefit, I subscribe to that. Prosperity has to be created, it has to be spread. We subscribe to that. We are slow in South Asia, which we are sincerely trying through SAARC. Changes are taking place in South Asia too. We as a country, the largest country of the subcontinent, are not very happy. We do not believe that India, with its economic growth, generation and distribution or redistribution of resources, commitment to inclusive growth and sustainable development, should race ahead, leaving the others behind. So we have put in place unilaterally, we have made offers, concessions to all the SAARC countries. We have done so. We are engaged with the countries of Central Asia. There are various regional platforms where the bigger countries work together with the smaller countries. I refer to South Asia, but that is happening also in Central Asia. That's happening in Middle East too. But all the economies are not of the same scale, as the countries are not. China is a country of 1.3 billion people. We are 1.1 billion people plus. So definitely there will be differences when it comes to the size of economies and therefore the growth too, when you look at countries which do not have the same. But I can see that it will not be a fractured economic rise of Asia. It will be coordinated, as I was referring to the larger economic integration of the Asian continent. Steps are being taken in that direction. I refer to the ASEAN plus 6 process, but this is happening through the Shanghai Cooperation Mechanism too. There is another platform, though it deals with all issues, but that is SICA. I refer to SAARC. Then there is the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. And there is a coordination between the different regional economic unions in Asia. It is not as robust as it is in Africa, between the 7 RECs and the Africa Union, but fortunately it is happening.
Okay. How many questions are there going to be, by the way? We have 15 minutes. Oh my God. At the end, we spend all the questions. Okay, I'll take 3 or 4 if you don't mind. So, Chopra, each one will be very brief. Yeah.
My name is Chopra. I work with the administration at the school. A few points that you raised. The consumption, 20 trillion, 7 trillion. You also mentioned
7 trillion is
the present. And you also mentioned the misbalance of population. Then you talked about poverty alleviation and a better life for people with growth. And then you touched on respect. Now my question is consumption the best model of growth from 7 trillion to 20 trillion? And when you bring in the respect aspect as a leader with such a huge population, what would be the impact of a huge consumption?
I think it should not be put in materialistic context. I refer to the historical divide which came with the arrival of the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution and the technologies that came riding that way. And it continued for centuries. So the countries which are populated but which were colonized are home to a very large number of impoverished people, poor people. The global population is 6 billion. It will rise to 9 billion, I said so. China and India alone put together are 2.4 billion. Now entire Asia put together, you're talking of close to half of the world's population, 46% in today's context, or 45. Its consumption is 7 trillion. Consumption is what? People have to eat, whether it's grain or fruit or vegetable or meat. Poor people don't have the resources even to have a proper diet. You have malnourishment. You have children dying young. And in this world, 1 billion people go hungry to bed. They live in abject poverty. Whereas 10 trillion is the consumption of US alone. And they are 5% of the world's population. Now should we change that or should we keep it? Still, when entire Asia put together with more than half of the world's population, with rising populations, will be consuming 20 trillion. We are talking of a time when the world's population will be 9 billion and Asia will be 4.5, for more than 5 billion. As US still will be consuming 15 trillion. So it's in what context you are taking my observation that matters. Is the hungry of the world. There was a comment made, I do not want to quote the person or the leader who said so. When the food crisis came, that it's because the people in India, people in Asia, in Africa are eating more. Does consumption pattern mean that the hungry must go hungry? Or should they be given food? Should they be given means to access what is the minimal human need?
Can I suggest we take 2 or 3 questions?
Yeah, that would be better.
Okay, I'll start with European voice and then I'll come to you and then to you. Okay, 3 voices.
Okay, Declan McFadden. I'm from Ireland but living in Singapore. I manage a multinational across Asia, so I'm very interested to hear what you're saying about Indian growth. You mentioned about you believe in cooperation, especially on economic matters. But that leaves the unanswered part, and we know that the global superpowers are all interested in getting the economies aligned again and get growth going. But we know that if there's a double-dip recession, it does exacerbate the geopolitical tensions. And there are some significant ones with your neighbours and with Afghanistan. So what are the risks that your wish to cooperate economically will be, let's say, affected by further stresses on the geopolitical side, whether it's with your neighbours or other geopolitical risks that exist around the world, and where the global superpowers, the new global superpowers, may not be fully aligned. So is that a risk or is that manageable?
Yong Jin Zhang, I'm a visiting professor at East Asia Institute at the US. In the discussion about China's rise, there is a lot of talk now about responsibility rather than the rise itself. I mean, from responsibility. Yeah, so from responsible stakeholder now actually has escalated into responsible leadership in global affairs. There doesn't seem to be a lot of talk about India's responsibility, also the rise of India. There are 2 questions here, very briefly. One is who defines responsibility here? And secondly, what do you see as India's responsibility as rising power?
Okay, third question. And then
one often hears that. Yeah, I'm Amar Patnaik. I'm doing a course, Master in Public Management here in the school, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, basically from India. The question is, one often hears that the growth in China is led by the government and the growth in India is led despite the government. Slightly uncharitable. But the point is, what do you foresee as the internal governance institutional deficiencies which might be detrimental to the resurgence of India's growth?
You got 3 challenging questions.
You see, my quick response to the first question, risks have always been there. It's not the first time that the world is facing economic crisis. Even after the Second World War, there were 2 sharp dips. And the regional ones, which was in South Asia. I did refer to Mexican and the Argentinian crisis. And there was never a decade in the world where some major conflicts had not been there. Whether it was the Suez crisis, the Korean War, I'm referring to the 50s, the Sino-Indian conflict in the 60s, the Indo-Pak conflict, conflicts in various parts of Africa, the Vietnam War, the second Vietnam War, that was China and Vietnam. So it is not that for the first time we are seeing a situation where some stress is there. So what we are saying, that the ideal way to address global challenges is by creating modules of governance, instrumentalities, which are inclusive and which are truly representative of the world. That helps in addressing the challenges better. That is my view. Now, when it was referred to as the responsibilities of rising powers, it's not a question of powers. It's the countries which are emerging on the global scene, re-emerging. We all have, countries big and small, as members of one large global community, one responsibility that we work together to create a balanced world order, a better world in which development of growth takes place, but at the same time countries and societies learn to live in harmony and with respect for diversity. We live in a pluralistic world, diverse world, different languages, cultures, religions, ethnic groups. And that's why a representative order and a democratic order addresses that question. What we will do as a country, India, we have been a responsible member of the Committee of Nations. Surely we will be willing, more than willing, to take greater responsibilities in global governance once India has its rightful place in the United Nations Security Council and the greater share in the IMF and the World Bank, which is going to happen. It has been delayed. It can not be denied. We will be seeing it. I am very clear. We will see this happening in half a generation, not even as long as that. Indians have their own sense of humor.
Including Indian students.
That is when you keep a low bar. I tell my officials, you always give me very low figures of our investments or trading. Recheck them. The Dean was referring to the figures the targets we were setting, but always exceeding those targets. We follow different political models, China and India. Our patterns of growth are different. Our consumption patterns are different. As I said, that our growth is domestic driven. That's why we were able to sustain. And despite a brief dip in industrial production, we went on to end the calendar year recording the highest industrial production of 15 years. It is domestic demand driven. And why? Because people have sustainable incomes and disposable incomes. If they don't have sustainable incomes, not disposable, then surely there won't be any demand created. And it's coming more from the rural economy. Now, government and people are partners. You cannot, in a democracy, divorce government and the people. They are elected by the people. We are the largest democracy. We have 714 million voters, and more than 60% of them cast their vote in the last election. They elect or they eject the governments. It's the people. So if the policies are not in harmony with the people's aspirations and expectations, the governments will change. It's as simple as that. At the same time, when people are given leadership responsibilities, governments, we have Dr. Manmohan Singh as the Prime Minister. He was the Finance Minister in 1991 when we embarked on this path of economic liberalization. Now this period is being referred to that of dramatic changes in India. Why those changes took place, we cannot say that this was like pre-Lehman and post-Lehman global economy. Those changes were necessary and India was ready for it. But if India did not invest in institutions, if it did not invest in our human resources, institutions of excellence, your IITs, IIMs, institutes of science, when did they come up? In the 50s, when Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister. After that, it's only in 2007, after a gap of close to 5 decades, that India decided to double the number of IITs, IIMs, increase 5 times the numbers of institutes of science, invest more in creating world-class universities. But the very fact that the country which was emerging very painfully after more than 2 centuries of subjugation was able to establish those institutions. That is why India was ready. I was saying today to the business leaders, in 1991, we had our sons and daughters who could latch on to the opportunities that came with this wave of new technologies and leapfrog to global leadership positions. But at the same time, the policies were put in place. Even if you look at present, why this has happened. We put in place the largest social security net ever created by any country in such a short span of time, benefiting so many millions as India has done between 2004 and 2009 to be precise. So it is always a partnership. The government and the people work together. And it would be a mistake to quantify the share or the blame. The challenges and opportunities are there before the citizens of the Republic. And leaders and citizens are all citizens first in a constitutional democracy. So they all have the responsibility. At the same time, the credit belongs to the people of India. No government which has the wisdom is going to take away that credit. Their entrepreneurial skills, the resilience of our industry, their confidence, and the aspirations of our young people. They are the true stakeholders in future. And I have enormous faith in the younger generation. They are going to write this beautiful story of India in this century.
Well, Minister, you came here to give us a glimpse, an Indian perspective on the resurgence of Asia in the 21st century. But I think you provided that, and you provided much more. But I think one thing that the students of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy realize is that the reason why things happen is because of leadership. And the reason why you can see that you're having a resurgence in Asia, why you're having a resurgence in India, is because now we have in these countries, especially in India, these confident, capable and courageous ministers like Minister Anand Sharma, and through your personality, you demonstrate to us what great leadership is. And for this, we thank you very much for coming here.